This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Your neighborhood just got cooler with Kroger Delivery's refrigerated trucks. Simply order groceries at the same great prices online as in-store, and we'll bring them to you fresh every time. And if that wasn't cool enough, you can now earn 4 times the fuel points after 4 with your digital coupon. Choose a next-day Kroger Delivery time slot for 4 p.m. or later on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Must deliver by February 4th. Restrictions apply. See Kroger.com for details.
Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen Khan.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast.
Last week's episode was on the Christmas truce football matches of 1914. It really happened. Germans and Brits got out of their trenches and played football together. Listen to us talk about how, why, and why it matters. If you haven't already, please check it out. Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. Today we're telling the story of a man and a woman, one dead, the other living, 2 football agents who have shaped the football transfer market. Or as the man in this duo, Mino Raiola, the Dutch-Italian agent, once said, I don't trade in the market, I am the market. Now, not many fans knew Raiola. You generally only used to see him as an extra in press photographs, a fat little man with owlish glasses, dressed in slobby leisure wear, pictured talking into one of his several phones while next to him an overdressed footballer loafs. And yet, Mino, this little guy, was one of the mightiest men in football.
I guess not all football fans will have known him, but some really have known him because as far as I can tell, he's probably the only football agent whose arrival at a training ground has been cheered and his name sung by fans, which happened at Juventus a couple of years ago. Mino Raiola is also the man who called Pep Guardiola a cowardly dog and who Sir Alex Ferguson called a shitbag.
Harsh.
I think he took, as we'll go on to explain, he took both as massive compliments. And in the end, I think Mino thinks that he won over both Pep and Sir Alex, which is the story that we're going to tell.
If you listen back to our Alex Ferguson podcast, we have the story of Ferguson calling him a twat and Mino not knowing what that meant because although his English is good, it wasn't that good.
Or his Scottish wasn't that good.
He died, Mino, in mid-career in 2022. But he's been succeeded by his longtime business partner, the Brazilian Rafaela Pimenta, who is now one of the handful of the most powerful women in football.
I would say now Marina's left the stage, the most powerful woman in football.
Marina of your beloved Chelsea.
Indeed, Marina Granovskaya, the ball-busting executive at Chelsea.
Well, obviously Chelsea have gone onward and upward in the brilliance of their recruitment and management since. Now, Mino and Rafaela have been instrumental in shaping the careers of the players they represent, and those players include Erling Haaland, Zlatan Ibrahimovic, the Italian keeper Gianluigi Donnarumma, and Paul Pogba. Now, it doesn't always work. As Mino told me, he failed with an equally brilliant player, Mario Balotelli, and that failure with Balotelli prompted him to think hard about why some footballers make it to the top and others don't, and we'll be discussing that. But more, Raiola and Pimenta embody the rise of the football agent over the last 30 years. Everyone loves to hate agents, except me and Mehreen, I think, actually. We're quite in favour. But agents have gone from non-entities in about 1990 to becoming arguably the most influential figures in the careers of most footballers. Because a player typically works with his club coach only for a year or so. But Zlatan Ibrahimovic, to take that example, spent 20 years with Mino.
And I guess the reason we're doing this podcast is because we've done podcasts on footballers and we've done podcasts on managers. And footballers are incredibly attached to agents, and often managers really hate these people. So who are they? I think I'm struck by, looking at doing research into this episode, how much of a function agents serve for players. Pimenta, for example, basically ends up living with Paul Pogba in the summer that he's about to leave Manchester United. Their influence is enormous on the choices that players make from their early teens to later in their life when they're about to retire. And as you said, they're usually cast as these rapacious middlemen that are just taking millions out of the game. This is the sort of stereotype that agents have. And I think if you asked any fan about their cursory idea of what a football agent is, this sort of shark type character. But our super agents, at least the two we're talking about in this episode, are coaches, they're therapists, they're lawyers, and they're far more to their clients. And I guess at the end of the episode, we're also going to talk about how super agents have now morphed into super agencies and the types of companies that are coming to represent footballers in all spheres of their professional rights. So that's not just their playing careers, but everything else that they do.
Yeah, agencying has gone from mom and pop stores, which is the kind we're describing today, to being corporatized. But when you say they are all those things, coaches, therapists, lawyers, and so on, they can also be sharks at the same time.
Indeed.
In this episode, we're going to uncover the mostly unseen influence and power of agents in football using the remarkable figures of Mino Raiola and Rafaela Pimenta. Much of what I'm going to be saying today is drawn from the day I spent with Mino in his hometown of Haarlem and my couple of meetings with Rafaela. So this is based on personal encounters as much as anything else.
Simon, give us some stats first about Mino.
Carmine Raiola, known as Mino, was born in Campania in southern Italy, Italian family, in 1967. He moved with his parents to Haarlem in the Netherlands as an infant. He ended up living in Monaco. He told me not just because it was a tax haven.
Because...
well, it's nice weather.
Loves Formula One.
Somerset Maugham called this a sunny place for shady people. And he died early from pulmonary disease, aged only 54 in 2022. Since then, his Brazilian business partner, Rafaela Pimenta, born in 1973, now runs the agency alone.
We've mentioned some of the clientele, which includes Zlatan Ibrahimovic, Paul Pogba, Erling Haaland. We can add to that Matthijs de Ligt, Henrik Mkhitaryan, Pavel Nedved, early OG of the Raiola camp, Ryan Gravenberch, Marco Verratti, Romelu Lukaku at one point, and Moise Kean are some of the players that have been represented by our power agents. Simon, you mentioned your encounter with Mino. When was it and how did it happen?
I'd met Rafaela Pimenta first. I was interviewing Paul Pogba in Turin when he was at Juve the first time. And Rafaela showed up and we got talking and she said, you should meet Mino. And so a couple of months later, I went to Holland. And like him, of course, I grew up there as an immigrant boy, maybe 20 miles from where he grew up. So about the same time. So we had a good base to start with. And the meeting is in his hometown of Haarlem. It's a lovely kind of dull, small town just west of Amsterdam. I actually cycled there from Amsterdam this summer. That's how close it is. He lived in Monaco with his wife and two sons, but he still kept this little pied-à-terre in Haarlem beneath his parents' flat on this rather drab street in the centre of town, not a super agent style territory.
What year was this?
2016.
Okay, so he's already at the peak of his powers.
He's at the peak of the peak, yeah. He walks in and you look at him and you think, you don't look like a football agent because, the game is very much about appearance. So Mino comes in, this little fat guy dressed in slobby gear.
He almost said that when he looked at you.
He probably thought that about me as well. Yeah. But he was almost wearing... Being small and fat, I know that there's certain clothes you shouldn't wear because
you're not small and fat, okay.
They emphasise the belly, for example. And so he kind of wears clothes that emphasise the belly deliberately. These quite tight T-shirts. If I had to guess, just, my eyes move to the door as he walks in, what's this man's job? As they say in Ireland when you pass someone on the street, now what manner of man do we have here? And if I had to guess what manner of man we had here, I'd have said a pizzeria... Waiter,
not even the owner.
Not even the owner on his day off.
Okay.
Now, of course, I was conflating what I knew about him and what I learned about him that day, which is that essentially he is a pizza waiter. He grew up working in his family's restaurant, which became the family restaurants because they were incredibly successful. And he still is like the perfect waiter in the sense that he walks in, I'm already there. I'm in this kind of kitchen style room because It's where he meets players when they're in Holland, and players are scared of offices because players don't really know how to function in an office. They've never been in an office. And so it's configured as a kitchen and there's a TV screen to watch games. He walks in, he says, you know what, shall I fix you an energy drink? I think an energy drink will really perk you up.
Have you ever had an energy drink in your entire life?
No.
I was going to say.
And he says, your jacket, you look a bit hot. Maybe you should take off your jacket.
Dutch or English?
It's in Dutch.
Okay.
Because we're sort of two immigrant boys about the same age who grew up in the Netherlands, but completely as outsiders to it, but quite fond of it. And he was talking about being discriminated against. And I said, as a foreigner, you can come to Holland, you can have a nice life, you can have a brilliant time, but you'll never become Dutch. And he said, that's right, no, you never become Dutch. So Mino and I would never be treated as Dutch just based on our ethnicity and appearance and names, but we function very well there.
And that is, I think, a special outsidery quality that is going to make him gel very well with people like Zlatan later on.
Yes, he's an immigrant boy and he's a waiter. And so he was treating me as if I was a customer in the family restaurant. And that's exactly how he treats his footballers, clients, or treated. He wanted to explain to me who he was, how did I become an agent? And he says, look, let's go back to where my family had its first restaurant. So we walk a few hundred meters from his pied-à-terre to this beautiful square at the center of Haarlem, the Grote Markt, the big market square with the church, which is a beautiful spot. And it's lined with cafes. He said, look, we came here when I was an infant in 1968. And he said lots of the Raiola family immigrated together from southern Italy, very poor then, to Holland, which was slowly starting an economic rise. He says we came with about 35 family members, and they lived in 3 adjoining houses in Haarlem. And they opened a pizza restaurant called Napoli here on the Grote Markt, on the big market square. So on the spot where his restaurant stood, there's now a different Italian restaurant. And we sit down at the outdoor seats and the owner comes and he's delighted to see us and he brings us free espresso. Mino's totally at home. He's in the middle of Haarlem. He's in an Italian restaurant. This is, And he says, look, the way it all started, he said, my dad worked 18, 20 hours a day here at this restaurant. At work, my dad's extreme. And so when I was 11 or 12, I went to work with my dad to get to know him. He was in the kitchen, so what could I do? I was a little kid at that point. I could wash up. He says, I still like washing up. It gives me a sort of peace to clean things, to see the instant result of your work. But he's a striver, so he graduates very young from being a washer-upper to being a waiter. So they put him in this little outfit. As a kid, he's waiting tables. So he's serving these adults, and he learns to talk to people. He's a bit like you. He talks twice as fast as normal people.
2x, yeah.
Yeah, Mino and you are both 2x people. I'm about 0.75x.
Yeah, if you're listening to this podcast when Simon talks, just speed it up, everyone.
The customer would come in and Mino wouldn't give them the menu. He'd say, what do you feel like today? What would you really like to eat? And the customer and he would discuss it, and then they'd come up with a personalized menu for each table. And if he saw the customer was having a bad day, like it was a regular who was getting divorced, Mino sits down with him and gives the often person 30, 40 years older than him counsel. I'm
now wondering what you looked like for him to offer you like a can of Red Bull or something. You must have been pretty low energy that day, more than usual.
There was a phase in my life when whenever I saw someone, they'd say, oh, you look really tired. I'd think, no, I'm fine.
You're like, I'm as pokey as I've ever been.
This is as good as it gets. They ran the kind of Italian restaurant that you wished you'd had on your own street corner.
I'm getting some shades of Sepp Blatter here. This idea of pleasing people, trying to understand their needs, being very hospitable, speaking many languages. Yeah, there is a bit of Blatter. I mean, Blatter also a little guy who, as he told us in the episode about him, had to kind of survive on the playground where everyone could beat him up. And so has to be charming, has to anticipate the other person's needs. Maybe there's a bit of that with Mino as well. Which is funny because FIFA will go on to be Mino's mortal enemy, as we'll discuss a bit later on. Yeah, I cannot imagine. I think he was even more disparaging about FIFA than he ever has been about Sir Alex Ferguson or Pep Guardiola. So that says something. I think he thinks Guardiola is the worst person in the world. So Mino compared his family to the Corleones of the Godfather films, but without the violence. He actually lent into that stereotype. He lent into the stereotype. Yeah, I've heard Italians ref it before, and I think, man, that's a racist movie. Yeah, it's a trope.
I mean, I was horrified when I finally saw the movie aged about 50. I had to stop watching, not just because of the violence, which I thought would turn me off, but it was so anti-Italian, don't you find?
Yeah, it was not a great PR.
Yeah, but I've heard Italians Americans say, yeah, man, that's my family.
He's also called FIFA a mafia too, so maybe he uses it selectively.
He was kind of happy to lean into the Corleones without the violence, and he says his parents taught him this service ethic. The pizzeria is like an extension of your home. The customers are family. Like at home, you keep the toilets clean, and then people will come back. And so they rack it up and end up with these 11 restaurants. And Mino is central to the business because it was the same in my family. He spoke better Dutch than his parents. As a teenager, he'd go to the bank to negotiate for his dad, or he'd pop in on the mayor of Haarlem to kind of, push for more business licenses, which not many teenagers do. And he had this other skill that he spoke fluent Italian, or at least he says Neapolitan. So one restaurant customer says, oh, Mino, I'm having these terrible problems with my Italian suppliers of my company. Mino says, no worries, I'll sort it out. And he calls the suppliers, sorts it out, and then he founds this company called Intermezzo, which helped Dutch companies do business in Italy. Mm-hmm. This is in his teens. Wow. And when he's 19, he becomes a millionaire because he buys a Haarlem McDonald's and sells it to a property developer. He's 19 years old, he's a millionaire, okay, in guilders, so it's like having, £300,000, but, money. Yeah, okay, but fair enough. I didn't have £300,000 when I was 19. After he does that deal, he says he stops being driven by money, although we will dispute that, I think, as we go on.
How much he's driven by money or how much money is just a natural consequence of the way that he behaves is the question. How does he come across football, though? So he's in Holland. I guess, as you've told me, everyone in Holland is obsessed with football.
In the 1970s, man, how could you not?
Yeah.
He claims that he was a good player. I mean, there's sort of rumours that he may have instigated that he was in one of the Dutch youth teams, which...
For Haarlem, he said that he played with them, but he fell out with people at the club, so...
Yeah, at one point the story went around that he played for a Dutch youth team. He may or may not have put that about, but it was not true, I think. So Haarlem, when I was growing up, they were in the top division, a nice little club. Players would cycle to training. Later on, they go bust. And, normally when a club goes bust, all the fans are weeping and, people gather at the ground and congregate and they found a new club. When Haarlem went bust, people just said, oh, yeah, right. And nobody bothered to...
We'll support Ajax now.
Yeah. He starts doing a law degree, drops out in his early 20s. He becomes technical director of FC Haarlem, that little club. Yeah, he drops out with people. He's developed this very complicated plan to sign the brilliant teenager Dennis Bergkamp from Ajax Amsterdam.
So he's a talent spotter.
Yeah, and he'd kind of read the contract. Dennis had some kind of youth contract at Ajax. And Mino had said, we can totally do this. And I think the idea is you sign Bergkamp age 17 and then you sell him to England or something. And he'd worked out this was totally feasible.
But this is quite remarkable because he's thinking about this in an era where the transfer market isn't what it is now. The idea of buying and selling players as freely across borders is just not the done thing.
Yeah, and also as one of the poorest clubs in the Netherlands to sign the biggest talent of the generation was audacious. So the plan to sign Bergkamp doesn't work out. The other Haarlem directors, who Mino thinks are stuffy old fools, say, we can't really sign the best player in the Netherlands and sell him to England. It doesn't work like that. So he leaves.
So Project Bergkamp may have flopped, but this does not deter Mino from getting involved in football transfers and seeing, I guess, not like that many people at this point, seeing a commercial opportunity in this business.
Well, at the start of the 90s, his timing is brilliant because at the start of the 90s, he's in his mid-20s. Money is just coming into football in Italy through Berlusconi's TV channels, in England through Sky. And so for the first time, it's kind of worth being in this industry. He speaks Dutch and he speaks Italian. So there's a lot of business you can do on that because the Italian clubs at this point are the biggest buying clubs in the world. Mm-hmm. So he goes in, this young guy, nobody's heard of him. He has this advantage, he says. I am fat and small. People underestimated me for a long time. He deliberately didn't wear suits because then he would look more grown up, more like a football industry person. The effect he wants to create is the secretary ushers you into the president and this little fat guy in a tight T-shirt
waddles in.
Waddles in. He's in disguise in a way. He's got this brain and he's figured out not many people in football have one.
So it's the opposite of the car salesman who's dressed in this slick suit, which makes you think that he's going to scam you. Whereas Mino dresses the opposite, and he might scam you, but actually he's really there to do a deal and, one that's going to benefit you and also him.
I have never done a deal in my life, but I can imagine that it's an advantage if the other person marks down your savvy by 30 points. Yeah.
I get where he's coming from. I like the jarring nature of just going into a space where you're not supposed to be, where people like you aren't supposed to exist, and then, getting what you need out of that situation.
Weren't you a shoe entrepreneur?
I used to sell trainers, yeah, but that was all done online. There was no... But I mean, I'm actually more talking about the fact in my general day-to-day life. Like often if I walk into a room where I have to interview a head of government or a CEO of a bank, they think that I'm the IT support, which has happened many times. But I kind of really enjoy that. Yeah,
and he's unusual in that he's a white man who is already rich at this point, but he's presenting himself as an outsider. He's hamming up the outsiderness.
Yeah, he's got dark-looking features. He's clearly unfit, not very healthy, and an athletic representing athletes. I mean, he just doesn't look the part. And when we introduce the figure of Rafaela, we'll also talk about her look, how she presents herself, and why it's in direct contrast to how Mino dresses and presents himself, and why I think that pairing is clearly a killer one. But we'll talk about that later.
Here's this guy. He has this deceptive look. He has his languages. He has this workaholism that he's inherited from his dad. He has a knack for business. And then he's a clever man in this very stupid industry. I'll quote you a line from my book, Soccernomics, which I co-wrote with Stefan Szymanski. Just as oil is integral to the oil business, stupidity is integral to the football business.
Oof, ouch. And this is because these executives are all Nepo babies or people who are mates and sons of players.
And ex-footballers. Yeah. So you've played football, you're very good at playing football, you have no business sense, whatever. You've never thought about it for more than 24 seconds, and suddenly you're technical director. Yeah.
When does he have this kind of penny dropping moment that he's actually the cleverest person in football?
He hits big football in 1992. He's not even mid-20s. And he helps arrange the transfer of Dutch winger Brian Roy, who you will recall, Nottingham Forest.
Yeah, actually, no, that's true. I do. I think I had the Premier League sticker book. I had one version of him. There you go.
So Brian Roy is a useless winger in that he's very skillful, but there's no kind of point to him. Ajax realised this, that he's a lovely footballer, but there's no product. And they sell him to Foggia in Italy. Mino is managing the transfer, and as part of his personal service, which will become the trademark of the agency, he spends 7 months living in Foggia supporting Brian Roy, and he helps paint Brian's house. He spends so much time in Foggia, it's where he met his wife. He also gets to know the very weird world of professional football. He says, look, many of these club executives got their jobs because they were likable ex-players, Nepo babies. And he told me incest makes that world weak. It's dumb because they want to keep it dumb. It's a closed world with gigantic potential, a huge turnover of money, but often managed by people of whom I think, what the fuck? And he said it's very weird in football because on the field it's excellent and you don't have any Nepo babies on the field because you wouldn't survive. But off it, he says there's very little excellence, and he once joked, other agents are even dumber than me. But he does meet this one football executive who he thinks is very smart, who become a key figure in the Mino story, Luciano Moggi. Do you remember Moggi? And I think it was he was a central figure in Calciopoli, the Italian bribery scandal of the early century.
Yes.
Moggi was technical director of Juve. Juventus turned out to be, he was calling referees before matches, and he was given a jail sentence, was a convicted fraudster, but a very clever man. So Raiola kind of admires him, and Moggi becomes the most powerful man in Italian football in the 90s. His career and Raiola's intertwine. So they first meet, I think this is a very Italian football moment. It's the early 90s. Moggi at that point is technical director of Torino. Raiola has been told to show up at 11 o'clock in the morning. And Raiola was compulsively punctual.
Because he's actually Dutch.
Yes, and he sees himself also as hyper-professional. And yeah, he's a mix of Dutch and Italian, which is quite a powerful thing to be. He arrives at 10:45. He told me the story. He says, I was brought into a room and it was like going to the dentist. There were about 25 people all smoking and looking at things and talking. At 11:15, nobody had come to me, so I go to the secretary and say, please can you tell Mr. Moggi I'm waiting, and can you tell me how long he will be? The secretary looks at Mino and says, she points around the room, the waiting room, and she says, all these people are waiting for Mr. Moggi. Actually, he's very impatient because in football, when I used to interview footballers and such, I used to think the first hour, that's on time. An hour late in football is on time. So he's pretty impatient that after 15 minutes, he's pushing. He's this 20-something. He has hardly any contacts in football, but he says to the secretary, you know what, I'm going, goodbye. I'm not going to turn up for someone who's late. 2 hours later, he says he ran into Modji in a restaurant, and maybe he went to find Modji. And he says Modji's there with this entourage of 25 people. All the people in the waiting room had come out for lunch with him. It was like a kind of medieval court, I suppose, with Modji at the centre dispensing favours. Raiola says he went up to Modji in the restaurant and he says, are you Mr. Modji? Modji says, yes. Raiola says, I find it very rude that you made me wait. And Modji says, which is what everybody's saying to Mino, who are you? Raiola says, I am Raiola, which apparently is the way you present yourself in Italian. It's formal to present yourself by your surname.
I am Cooper.
You would say, I am Khan. And Modji says, you're Raiola, meaning I've marked your name. I'm the most powerful man in football, soon to be. Modji says, if you're this unpleasant to me, you will never sell a player in Italy.
So this now will become a recurring theme that Mino pisses off the most important person in his contacts book. And he'll do that over and over again.
Yeah, he's fine.
Suffer no professional consequences for it.
The only people he never tries to piss off are his players. Yeah. The rest of the world is fair game.
He's doing this even at the burgeoning stage of his career.
Yeah, right at the beginning when most people are sucking up. And Modji is wrong because he does start selling players in Italy because he's come in just as money is flooding into the game. And then, better yet, the Bosman ruling happens. It's 1995. And the European Court of Justice says you can't have restrictions on numbers of foreign players from within Europe. So you can't have English clubs saying you can only have 2 foreigners. If they're Europeans, an English club can field 11 foreigners, and it's soon a very special club does that. Chelsea.
Are we the first ones?
I think you're the
first
first
ones.
ones.
We are the first ones, yeah. I remember the game against Sunderland. On free movement of labour, isn't it?
Yeah, so free movements of labour. So you can go to any club in the EU if you're European, and if your contract expires, you're now a free agent, which didn't used to be the case.
Exactly. So 6 months before you know that you're going to end, you can start talking to people.
Yeah, and your club can't demand a transfer fee or stop you or anything. So it's a golden time for players and agents. And Mino's loving it. While he was living with Brian Roy in Foggia, he got to know the Foggia coach, who's a workaholic Czech called Zdeněk Zeman. Zeman is so extraordinary that I checked, he was still coaching this year, age 76, at Pescara, and he only stopped because he had heart surgery. So Zeman is hardcore. He's what Mino would call an extremist. And these two extremists, they talk football obsessively, both workaholics. Zeman's all about everyone has to run marathons all the time.
Training, you mean?
Yeah, and just you have to be so fit you can't even imagine. And Raiola says to him one day, look, you want a footballer who doesn't exist. You have in your head this perfect footballer, a guy who runs 17K a match, who dribbles like Maradona, and who trains 14 days a week. That guy doesn't exist. But then weirdly, in 96, Raiola is in the Czech Republic because from this point he never stops traveling. And he sees Zeman's perfect footballer. This guy runs 17K a match, incredibly skillful, and then at his club he trains, and then he goes home and he does the rest of his training. And this guy is Pavel Nedved. Nedved becomes Raiola's client and also his dream footballer, his model for all other footballers. And he tells all his clients in future, you have to be like Nedved. Mino told me Pavel Nedved is an extremist, i.e. the highest word of praise for Mino. The only thing he thinks of himself is that he can't play football because Nedved was very skillful, but he was not Zidane. But he can train harder than the rest. And that's sort of how Mino was an agent as well. He said, resting is not part of my profession. In 96, he sells Nedved to Zeman, and Zeman is now coaching Lazio. Nedved quickly becomes the hottest figure in Italian football.
In the hottest league
in the hottest league in the world, yeah. By this point, Luciano Moggi, Raiola's nemesis, had moved up to the top job in Italian football. He's technical director at Juve. And one day Moggi calls Mino and says, look, I want to buy Nedved from Lazio, because obviously the best players in Italy have to play for Juve. Raiola told me about their conversation. Mino loves telling stories. I mean, that's part of being a people person. He loved, I still think of him in the present tense. And Mino says to Moggi, do you have a watch? Moggi says, don't be unpleasant. Yes, I have a watch. And Raiola says, tell me what time we're meeting. Moggi says, in Florence at 12 o'clock. Raiola says, I will be there at 11:50, but I will leave at 12:10 if you're not there. And at that point, the price of Nedved doubles. Of course, Moggi isn't there at 12:10, obviously. Moggi doesn't show up for anyone on time. That would be an admission of weakness. So at 12:10, Raiola leaves. In the end, Nedved does join Juve. And in 2003, he won the Ballon d'Or for world's best footballer.
So Mino is playing this role of a scout. He's traveling around Europe trying to find the kids that he thinks have got the extreme qualities that he wants to represent. And I think that sort of subverts what we think of agents, which is they latch onto players that already they know it's obvious that they're going to become superstars. But actually he's doing much more of the donkey work of trying to find out who he wants to represent.
Well, this is a time when clubs are mostly not doing proper scouting and there's no data yet.
It's just Arsene Wenger, right? And Mino.
Only Wenger. So Wenger, at this point in 96, he brings Patrick Vieira from Milan to Arsenal. And nobody has heard of Patrick Vieira. And Vieira plays for 45 minutes against Sheffield Wednesday. And the whole Arsenal crowd say, oh, right, okay, I get it. Whereas, now the whole of Europe would have known about Patrick Vieira when he was 9 years old.
But Mino's also really discerning about what kind of players he wants.
Yeah, because he can
in
read
his
people.
Stable. Yeah.
I mean, he will clash with Ferguson, but what he has in common with Ferguson is that they both have workaholic fathers who they deeply admire. So what they're looking for is people with a massive work capacity, because also that is like a multiplier of your talent. I mean, that's what Cristiano did. He multiplied his very high talent by being a workaholic. And it's what Mario Balotelli didn't do. He probably had more talent than Cristiano, but he demultiplied it.
But his own work ethic also comes to some personal cost towards him, as he told you too.
Yeah, so he spends 30 years nearly traveling around Europe with this little suitcase working. And he admitted to me, it cost me things. I haven't seen my children grow up. So he always thought he was the best agent in football, but he didn't think he was the best father. He estimated towards the end that he spent 30 days a year at home in Monaco and the other 11 months on the road visiting his beloved players. If my wife is listening, I think this should show her that I'm not that bad.
Yeah, he's not that bad.
And Mino's wife complained. She said, you have 2 official children and loads of unofficial ones, meaning his footballers. And he joked, which are the official ones? He has such a fund of stories. He's met everyone in football. I'd love to ghostwrite his autobiography.
Oh, so you tried to do a deal?
Well, I hinted.
Are you good at hinting?
Well, I mean, we were like mates.
Okay.
I think a lot of people who are not Ferguson or Guardiola, they quickly feel he's your mate. Yeah, we had a lot of chemistry, I think. Okay. But I mean, he brings most of the chemistry because he can read you and he's charming. He's very directed at you. He
makes you feel special.
He makes you feel special, but he's also observing you and learning about you, which is what people do. Yeah. I mean,
you shot your shot?
So I said, how about I ghostwrite your autobiography? Something like that.
Okay.
And he said, well, I've kind of promised it to Willem Vissers, who's this very good Dutch journalist. When we were researching this app, I Googled. I thought, well, Willem must have written. And he didn't. They didn't get there on time, so there isn't a Mino book.
That's super sad. There may be a transcript, perhaps. Maybe we should reach out. Well, talking of deals, how does Mino do his deals? What is the way that he approaches contract negotiations when he's with a club and I've got a player who needs to move?
Well, he said contract negotiations are my matches. So he'd go in there like a footballer before a big match.
He'd train, eat some pizza, put the T-shirt on.
Yeah. He's carefully dressed up to look as bad as possible. And he goes in, he says, to give 100% to get the maximum for his player. And that might sound obvious, but a lot of agents are not doing that because a lot of agents are, as the Dutch say, eating off multiple walls. They're trying to stay on good terms with the club so they can foist one of their bad players on the club. They want to get a payoff from the club. Like the club
being a journalist, no? A good one or a bad one? If you're a bad one, you're all about access and maintaining relationships. And if you're a good one, you don't give a fuck and you just write what you need to write because it's true.
I agree. It's about being a good journalist is about, I always think I'm going to burn every bridge. Yeah. I'm willing to burn every bridge.
Scorched earth all the time.
Yeah. I mean, if I respect and think the person is a really good egg, then I'll write that. But if I don't, then and if they never want to see me again, that's fine. But it's harder if you're a beat journalist, like you're always meeting the same people. It's harder to burn every bridge. Yeah. And so those people have to be nice guys. But Mino says, look, I'm working for my players. I'm not working for the clubs. So some agents will get a payoff from the club. Like the club will say, you know what, let's agree we're going to undercut the player's salary and he'll stay at the club and he'll sign a 4-year deal and we'll give you a payoff.
They narrow the options rather than the other way around.
Yeah, and the agent comes back to the player and says, well, you better take this deal. It's not great, but...
We're stuck, exactly.
Yeah, we're stuck. Mino said, no, I'm happy to walk away from the table. I'm going to get every last penny out of it for my player. And when the deal is done, he doesn't celebrate. He goes away fretting, maybe I could have got even more if I'd pushed them even harder.
I guess he's told you many stories, but there's one in particular that stands out about a contract negotiation.
Yeah, and it's a player called Rodi Terpijn who told it himself. Now, Rodi was going to be the next big thing in Dutch football. I mean, Thierry Henry used to ask after him because they'd played France-Holland under 21s, and Rodi breaks into the Ajax first team, I think just after they win the Champions League in 95, and he's a defender. And, Ajax produced all these great players in a rush, Clarence Seedorf, Edgar Davids, Patrick Kluivert. Now there's this new kid in the first team, Rodi Terpijn, he's going to be the next, great thing. And he is.
Spoiler alert, given that most people would not have heard who he is, it doesn't work out, but...
Yeah, so he plays a couple of years in the Ajax first team, and it becomes clear he's not good enough for that level. So 98, Ajax want to get rid of him. He was a young talent who disappoints. It happens all the time. Rodi only has one thing going for him, which is his agent, who is Mino Raiola, who picked him up thinking he was going to be the next big thing. Rodi became a very good writer. He's a very clever man. He wrote a lovely story himself about the deal that changed his life. It appeared in the Dutch literary football magazine Hartgras that I've been writing for on and off for 30 years. This is a Mino Raiola deal. He and Terpijn drive to a motorway hotel, which classically is where football deals happen. So if you're Brian Clough in the 90s, you're showing up, you're expecting the other person to show up with a bag of cash for you.
In a Premier Inn.
So they meet in this motorway hotel in the middle of the Netherlands with a chairman of a small Dutch club. The club's De Graafschap.
They're in the Premier League. They're in the...
I think they were in the Eredivisie at that point, but they're a smallish provincial club. So Rodi's career is going downwards.
Wolves.
Yeah, it's Holland, so it's all a scale or 4 lower.
Okay.
Yeah. So nobody wants you. You can go to De Graafschap. So they sit down, and Mino starts by impressing the chairman by gossiping about Pavel Nedved.
That's such a journalistic technique.
Is it?
Share gossip about things that you've heard.
Yeah, Seymour.
Wins trust.
Lots of drop names. But Seymour Hirsch once told me that. He said, you give them information, and then they want to give you information. So the chairman's impressed. He writes down on a piece of paper the salary that he wants to offer Terpijn. And he probably writes a higher salary just because of the Pavel anecdote. Rodi looks at the salary on offer on the piece of paper, and he thinks, that's really good. That's more than I earn at Ajax. Brilliant. It's the only club that want me. They're offering more than I earn at Ajax. We're done. Mino looks at the salary on the piece of paper and he starts shouting. He says to the chairman, do you know what Rodi earns at Ajax? This is not a serious offer. Come, Rodi, we're not going to waste our time. So Mino stands up and starts walking out of the motorway hotel. Rodi's like, what, we're going to leave this really good offer? What's going on? But, he's just the player. So he stands up and he follows Mino out. But Rodi's a very polite guy, not like Mino. So he's looking apologetically at the chairman like, I don't know what's happening here. The chairman runs after them and says, no, guys, don't leave. Stay, we'll talk. In the next 20 minutes, Mino negotiates a contract for Rodi Terpijn, a guy who's on the way out of top football. And that contract, Rodi writes, largely secured my future, not only for the 4 years that I would play for the Graafschap, but just about for the rest of my life. Just in a 20-minute negotiation, that's the kind of agent you need. You see, this is also what Mino believes. So you might think, well, negotiating a contract for Zlatan or Nedved or Pogba is what it's really about.
And it's easy because their value is just
Their value is very high. A lot of clubs want them. And then you think, oh, well, the contract for the guy who's going to the Graafschap in Holland, I'll send my aide to do it. I don't really care about that. But Mino says, no, every contract can change somebody's life. And the effect on Rodi's life is bigger than any of Ibrahimovic's contracts, because Ibrahimovic got so many contracts, they were so big, it didn't really matter. But here's a guy, this is the biggest contract he's ever going to sign in his life.
So Mino is developing a stable of players and he's getting a reputation within the player community as somebody that's going to represent you and get you a lot of money, which means that he's now becoming popular. So he's expanding his stable and so he's got to hire people. And here we introduce the character of Rafaela Pimenta.
Rafaela Pimenta, when she meets Raiola, she's teaching international law at a public university, I guess a state university in Brazil. So she's an intellectual, she's an academic, but in Brazil, if you work for the state sector, obviously salaries are terrible. And she told me they paid me like €6 an hour. With €6, you couldn't pay the parking.
Wow.
So she's a very intelligent, multilingual woman. I think she really likes teaching law, but she's making nothing at all.
And they have this incredibly serendipitous encounter?
Yeah, I think Mino's doing a football deal in Brazil. He needs some legal advice. And so he meets Rafaela, a lawyer, who speaks every language, and he says to her, you should work for me, or with me. I think with is the operative word. She quits her PhD and she follows him to Monaco, and she says they became equal partners in this tiny office. She said it was about as big as a table, so small they had to take turns making phone calls. Now, I interviewed her about herself and Mino, and she said Mino was the quicker decision maker and she was stronger on detail, and she suspects these are probably gendered traits. And they travel around Europe together to negotiate with clubs. It's a slightly odd couple, this little fat guy in a tight T-shirt and this Brazilian woman. And as you know, women are not supposed to have top jobs in football, is the idea in the stupid game. Everyone opening the door is like, what? Where's the real agent? Yeah. Mino would introduce her as the lawyer because he thought that sounded chic. But also she admits, for years I would not let anyone say I was a football agent. People have so much prejudice against agents that it influenced our self-esteem. So she was kind of embarrassed to be thought of as an agent. Rafaela and Mino become a duo, but they're a visually quite unlikely combination, aren't they? What's your take on their look?
So we've done the Mino kind of deliberate, contrived scruffiness, potentially.
Well, I think he had innate scruffiness and he brought it out. He kind of groomed his scruffiness.
He didn't try to untrain himself out of it. And Rafaela looks very much at home in the world of professional football executives. So she is, I would say she's very chic. She's very well put together. She wears the sorts of jewelry and the brands that you see footballers' wives wearing or other senior women in football. She looks like a natural extension of somebody involved in a game where there's lots of money and image is very important.
Except that almost everyone else in those jobs is a man.
Exactly. I think there's probably a lot of things going on here. One, I think it's quite a jarring contrast between them. And the other thing is that I don't think as a woman, Rafaela can afford to be scruffy or not look the part because she's already got two disadvantages. One, her gender. And as she's also explained, her background, she's a Latina woman. So she's not European. She speaks European languages.
Well, but she's quite a chic Brazilian. I mean, she's a white, I would say, high-status Brazilian from the start.
She's talked about not being able to disentangle when she's experiencing racism or sexism. And I get that. I get that a lot. Often you think you're being patronised. Why am I being patronised? Is it because I'm a woman? Or is it because I'm not the right kind of woman? Is it because I'm young? Is it because my background's not right? So I think she rightly diagnoses that there's a lot of things going on when she's in a room with football executives. We're going to talk about that a bit later. But for her, dressing the part is a way to minimise some of the other structural iniquities that she's going to face. Mino, as a man, is allowed to lean into a scruffy look. She would never be able to do that.
Yeah.
So you can imagine the two of them walking into a club executive's room to do contract negotiation. Mino in probably a leather jacket, some chinos and a T-shirt, whereas Belly's...
No, that's much too high.
Really?
Tracksuit or jeans from 1984... and an old T-shirt,
unshaven.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have Rafaela, who's probably in a Chanel two-piece with a Birkin handbag and the kind of jewellery that women are supposed to wear. And they're both sort of a representative of different parts of the footballing world.
Both outsiders in this footballing world. But she says that she and he were really equal partners from the start. Certainly she's as bright as he was. I didn't realise that they were equal partners when I first met her in Turin. I thought she was Mino's right-hand woman, but maybe I'm also being guilty of misogynist bias and assuming that as a woman she was the number two, but who knows how exactly it worked between them.
Well, she said herself that at the beginning, when she was introduced, she was quite happy being, again, a bit like Mino says, being underestimated as just the woman behind him, when ultimately they were both wearing the trousers.
Yeah, I think she liked to wield her power quietly and he liked to wield his power noisily. But I mean, also to his credit that he was able to hire an extremely talented woman, which is something almost nobody in football is doing. So this whole talent pool of 52% of the population, everyone else is neglecting except Mino. So the two of them decide, look, we're just going to have a small stable of players because our thing is we give each player total personal attention, just like the Raiola family gave to their customers in the pizzerias. And this somewhat limits your earning potential because the other way is to stack them up. You run a kind of McDonald's of agencies. And that's what Jorge Mendes, the great Portuguese agent, does. He has loads and loads of players.
Jonathan Barnett, I think, has over 800 at one point.
Wow. What you do is you have sub-agents who handle them. So your kind of second division player never actually meets the top guy.
Sure.
Now, I think most fans don't quite realise how central an agent is to a player's life and career. But when you read autobiographies of footballers, which I do, the agent typically emerges as this very rare figure, which is the player has his entourage from childhood, the family and a couple of old trusted friends, and then girlfriends get added onto that. But the agent is the one person the player meets after achieving success who becomes close to him, a confidant. That's because everyone the player meets wants a piece of the player. And so he needs someone to protect him. The agent also wants a piece of the player, but the agent is supposed to act as the gatekeeper who stops everybody else taking a piece.
I mean, you know it's a big deal because when players change their representation, it makes the news. Probably makes the news more than when they get divorced or when they even leave a club. I'm thinking of like Victor Osimhen this summer. Like he has this terrible summer where he doesn't get his move and he ditches his agent, and that's quite a sign of a big sort of breakup between a player and his most, relied on confidant.
I find that when I read football media, they obsess about the relationship between player and manager.
Mm-hmm. I think it's changed.
But I think the player-manager relationship has long been much less important because the average tenure of a manager is now just over a year. So the player thinks, oh, this bloke has come along and he'll be my temporary manager for a year. Probably won't make much difference. But my agent is with me my whole career. My agent is talking to me after every match, how I played. My agent is plotting the next move, plotting my retirement. So the agent's much more important than the manager. And they also think, well, the coach sees me as a useful asset for this season, but the agent wants me to succeed for the next 15 years. So the agent's stake in the player is much, much bigger than the coach's. Now, lots of players are betrayed by their agents, and often they suffer huge career damage because it's in the interest of both the club and the agent that the footballer is kept dumb, that the footballer doesn't understand how the transfer market works or what deal is being done. And typically when the deal is done for a player to move or to renew his contract, the player isn't even at the table while these negotiations are happening that will determine his career. And sometimes the club and the agent might agree a secret deal between themselves. So maybe the club will pay the agent a bonus if the player stays with them, or if the player's contract is kept below a certain level and the player isn't told. And what can also happen is suddenly the player is sold and you see him on the photographs holding up the shirt of a new club with the grinning club chairman, and the cameras are snapping and the player is thinking inside of himself, why am I here? Why have we joined this club? And it's something that the agent will have done against the player's interests. So, for example, maybe he's moving this player to a club as a sweetener so that the club will buy his other player. Or he's done the player's old club a favour by moving him away and the old club will give the agent a bonus. And so the player is often just the victim of the agent's schemes. And some players only come to understand this power dynamic very late in their careers or after they retire. And many players never come to understand it. They never understand the forces that shape their moves and their careers. But I don't think Raiola was ever like that. He always claimed, and I think mostly truthfully, that he only served the interests of his very small stable of players.
And he can do that because if you only have a smaller stable, you're less inclined to do favours or trade-offs because you just don't need to
you don't have 20 or 30 other players that you're trying to place. Yeah. And his ideal was if all went well, he and the player would make each other rich over a long career. And I said, does that mean you take 10% of the salary? And then he got a bit cagey. He said, or more or less. But that is agreed and is very transparent. And I said, do you see your players as friends? And he said, 99% of them, yes. I said, so you don't see Pogba as a client? Mino said, I don't see him as a client at all. In fact, I dare to say family. And I wonder if Pogba also felt that.
Well, I mean, I think the last images of Mino before he dies are in this otherwise terrible documentary on Amazon called The Pogmentary.
Oh my God.
Which is describing that summer where Pogba is playing for France at the Euros and then needs to leave Manchester United, or it's clear that his future at Manchester United is over. And the documentary just tracks him speaking to Mino on FaceTime almost every single day about the options. Is it Real Madrid? Can I go to PSG? Who wants me? Who needs me? And the other thing that's really striking is that Pimenta basically is living with Pogba for that summer. She moves in his family home in Manchester. She's watching over his kids. She's there at every family meal. I think she even goes on holiday with them. And she's sort of introduced in the documentary as his lawyer. And then you think, well, this is a bizarre relationship to have with a lawyer. And it's just not normal. And I've heard
Hunter S. Thompson with his Samoan attorney going around Las Vegas.
Exactly, a bit like that. And so, I've heard Rafaela speak about her relationships where she said, look, I cannot maintain any discernible real divide between a personal and professional relationship with my clients. I mean, she's doing everything for them. And often because they're young men, she's giving them life advice, relationship advice, not just about their financial decisions, but about where they want to live and how they should invest and who they should keep around themselves, emotional support. I think in this sense, Rafaela is perfect because she's such a natural extension of Mino's pizzeria brand, right? She's just able to tap into so much of that human element. And I mean, I wouldn't recommend that documentary for many people, but if you just want to see how weird and odd it is to think of most of us don't have agents, but somebody that we have a professional relationship just kind of moving in with us and like doing the babysitting, taking out the dry cleaning. It's just bizarre.
I have a literary agent, but I don't think he's going to move in with us.
We're saying the bar pretty high, Gordon, if you're listening.
Gordon, it's okay. I don't need you to do that. And Mino was the same as Rafaela in this way. So some players would ring him twice a day. You're describing Pogba. And once Mario Balotelli calls and says, my house is on fire.
Did you lift up his shirt and say, why it was me?
And Mino said, I think maybe you should call the fire brigade. Because footballers don't know these things.
Yeah.
Mino would show his loyalty to players by doing these public rants against their clubs and their managers, especially against Guardiola, who is the man he loved to hate.
Yeah.
So when he's ranting against Guardiola, he's showing Ibrahimovic, I will always be on your side. I'm taking on one of the most powerful people in football for you.
The Mourinho tactic, as we mentioned, please go back and listen to our 2 episodes on Jose.
I'd much rather spend time with Mino than with Mourinho. So I said to Raiola, look, what you did, and it seemed obvious to me, what you did is you turned the model of your family pizzeria, serving these regulars in a very personal way, you turned that into a football agency. And I don't know whether he was just charming me, but he looked like he'd never thought of it before. And his eyes brightened and he said, unconsciously, yes, unconsciously. And he said, when you say that, I get a little bit of goose flesh. Ooh. And he said, and it's true, when we had the pizzeria, we didn't see ourselves as a pizzeria. And I said, well, what were you if not a pizzeria? He said, we were a home.
Yeah. I mean, they're mum and dad, right? Rafaela and Mino.
Yeah. Yeah, he's done his parents, he's replicated his parents. No, I thought that was very beautiful.
Join us after the break, where we're going to be talking about how Mino Raiola not just shaped the careers and lives of his players, but of the modern transfer market as we know it. We'll also be talking about his seminal relationship with Zlatan Ibrahimovic, which is probably the longest and most significant relationship between an agent and player in football history.
Join us after the break.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
This is a reminder that you're listening to Heroes and Humans of Football with me, Simon Cooper.
And me, Mehreen Khan. Welcome back to Heroes and Humans, where you join us in 2001, where a young footballer called Zlatan Ibrahimovic is about to have a meeting that changes his life. The meeting is with Mino Raiola. Simon, tell us the story.
So you have these 2 immigrant boys. Zlatan, Swedish, but parents from former Yugoslavia. Mino Raiola, the agent, is a Dutch-Italian. His Italian family had immigrated to Holland when Mino was a baby. So they meet in this very chic Japanese restaurant in Amsterdam, the Okura restaurant, which is a kind of celebrity footballer place.
So they're not in the pizzeria.
They're not in the pizzeria, but we'll come to what Mino eats. And at this point, 2001, Zlatan is terrible at Ajax. He's 19. I used to watch Ajax quite a bit then, and the fans would be shouting at him the whole match. Like he'd be offside all the time without knowing it. He'd get the ball, and instead of scoring from 5 yards out, he'd dribble around himself and then lose the ball. He just always, every decision he made was wrong. People could see he had talent, but people were also totally fed up with him. So he is going to meet this reasonably big name agent already, Mino Raiola, and Zlatan wants to impress him. So how does a footballer try to impress? He arrives in a Porsche. He parks the Porsche in front of the hotel entrance. It's the Hotel Ukura with a restaurant. Zlatan has put on this amazing suit and he's wearing all his bling. And he strides into the hotel like, I'm Zlatan.
I see.
And he gets to the table and he's going to meet this great famous agent, Mino Raiola, and he sits down. Raiola turns out to be this little guy who's wearing a Nike T-shirt over his potbelly.
Stretched over his
potbelly. Mino could do good cop or he could do bad cop, and he knew which one Ibrahimovic would respect. So he's bad cop. The waiter comes, Raiola says, I'm not eating any of this Japanese stuff, and he orders pasta in this Japanese restaurant because he's always showing that he breaks the rules. He eats enough pasta for 6 people. In between bites, he's telling Zlatan what a rubbish waste of space he is.
Yeah.
He says, you've achieved nothing. And he says to Zlatan, do you want to be the best in the world? Or do you want to be the player who earns the most and can show off the most stuff? Of course, Ibrahimovic understands the right answer and he says, look, I want to be the best in the world. Ibrahimovic is really impressed by him. He calls him afterwards and he says, Mino, I want you to be my agent. Mino takes this long pause like he's thinking about it. And then he says, okay, but if you're going to work with me, you have to do what I say. And Zlatan says, yeah, totally, man, absolutely, I'll do whatever you say. Mino says, sell your cars, sell your watches, and start training 3 times as hard because your stats are rubbish. Mino says, it's ridiculous that you already have all this bling at your age. What are you going to want in 3 years' time? An aeroplane. He knows that Zlatan has a big head, so his job is to show him that he is nothing and that his goal is to become like Pavel Nedved.
And he goes through a list of other strikers playing at that moment and their stats, and by comparison, he tells him that you're crap.
Yeah, I think so.
Which is quite a humbling moment.
So Zlatan is barely 20, and the choice of agent at this point may have changed the trajectory of his career. Because now with Mino, he's got an agent who's plugged in to the biggest clubs. He can find his players a place at the biggest clubs if they're talented enough. So he's aiming for the top. And Mino says, look, before Zlatan came to me, he was with an agent who was trying to move him from Ajax to Wolves. I think Wolves were...
Second mention of Wolves in this episode.
Yeah.
Disparagingly.
But at that point, they were even lower than now. I think they were not in the Premier League. Mino says, imagine this counterfactual world. Zlatan, age 19, 20, goes to Wolves. Maybe he never makes the big time. He becomes a kind of Balotelli figure that somebody says, oh, yeah, he had talent, but, didn't have his head screwed on right. Raiola says players also need an agent who can teach them about life at the top. And he says that's why it's stupid to let your brother or your dad be your agent, because they don't understand what you need to be to become a top-class footballer. And Mino knew exactly what a top-class footballer was. It was his client, Pavel Nedved. And he says to Zlatan, you think you know what training is? He says, if you train with Pavel Nedved for 1 day, you'll go home in tears. Because Nedved would train all day. I mean, the training at the session at the club was just a kind of light break for him because the other players weren't fit enough. So, it was a much lower level than he was training at home.
And he's also doing the opposite of what you think somebody who wants to represent you does, which is to blow smoke up your ass. I think there's one maybe potentially apocryphal version of this conversation where he tells Zlatan to go and get fucked. And that's the moment where Zlatan realises that he's in love. I'll be honest, I've had that as well. When people told me to go fuck myself, I immediately liked them much more than I did before they said that. And there's something else going on here, right? I guess his working class origins are also something that helps Mino relate with so many of his players. We mentioned the first generation immigrant, the outsider status. In the book, I Am Zlatan, where he talks about this encounter at the hotel, that's a book where Zlatan is talking about, a lot of his early life, which is coming up against the sort of bourgeois strictures of Swedish society that he wants to break, and he wants to piss off the whole establishment. And Mino is kind of living proof of how you do that and succeed. So I imagine it just would have been, it's just a marriage made in footballing heaven.
Yeah, I think he hero worships Mino. So Mino becomes his guiding light, and from then he'll do what Mino says. There's this weird improvement in Zlatan, and I remember 2002, everyone was totally fed up with him. They're playing Champions League against Lyon. He does this step over at the edge of the box. Everyone's like, oh God, Zlatan's doing his step over thing again. And he steps over left, he steps over right, loses the defender, hits it into the bottom corner.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks, oh wow, he's grown up. And I think that was Mino. So very quickly after meeting Mino, Zlatan gets too good for Ajax. Raiola has to make the decision, where is Zlatan going to go next?
And he has a very unique way of trying to do this chess game, right? So how he calculates what's good for the player and what clubs want. It's not just about who's offering us the most money.
Yeah, he says we decide. We don't sit around waiting for a club to make an offer. We decide where we want to go, and then we tell the club, we've chosen you. And he told me, I always try to formulate a goal with a player. This is what we want. We don't sit and wait and see where the wind blows. If you've got a very talented player, there's going to be multiple clubs. And so with Zlatan, he has a choice. And his choice is that Zlatan has to go to the most extreme club in Italy, which is Juventus. Now, extreme in Mino diction is a compliment. It means workaholic. It means brutal. At Juve, they only care about stats. So when Zlatan arrives there, Fabio Capello, the coach, sits him down with this video of Marco van Basten. Capello doesn't say anything, leaves the room, turns on the video. And Zlatan watches the video, and it's just Van Basten scoring goals. Zlatan realizes, right, that's what they want me to do. They want me to score a lot of goals. They don't want me to do step-overs. That's what Juve is about. And also you work all the bloody time. Mino says, Ibrahimovic is someone you have to sit on top of, a kind of wild horse. And that's what Juventus do. You come in at Juve, there are the Juve rules. You do this, you do that. And so it was the club that was going to make Zlatan great. And it turned out to be true.
I guess through the agents, you learn about the culture of clubs. So, Juventus at this period, disciplined, extreme. I've heard Rafaela talking about Bayern Munich and how of all the clubs she deals with, she loves dealing with Bayern Munich because they will just tell you yes or no, black or white. We want him, we don't want him. If we want him, we'll pay. If we don't, we don't. And I guess this is the sort of hidden part of footballing institutional culture that we don't know about. But I think agents are a really interesting way to sort of understand how clubs are perceived in the commercial realm of dealing with players.
Well, not only don't we know that, but the player doesn't know it either. So you're a very good 20-year-old player. You don't understand the difference between arriving at Bayern, arriving at Juve, arriving at Real Madrid. The agent, if they're plugged into all those clubs, they can tell you exactly what the club is like.
Yeah, what culture you're about to enter into.
So when he decides that Zlatan's going to Juve, he gets in touch with his old nemesis, Luciano Moggi, who is the technical director of Juve still.
Not yet in prison.
Not yet convicted. Things slightly go wrong on the day of the deal, and it ends up Raiola is wearing beach shorts, so he looks even less...
That's just a Wednesday, no?
He's wearing beach shorts and he has to run across Turin to the place where Moggi is because he was in the wrong place. So he's sprinting with his belly in his beach shorts through Turin. He's soggy with sweat. He arrives. Moggi is not impressed, but they do a deal with a transfer fee of £13 million. This is 2004 for Zlatan to move from Ajax to Juve. Zlatan becomes Nedved's teammate at Juve, and very soon he comes back to Raiola and says, I thought you were exaggerating about Nedved, but it's true. He works all the time. And Nedved tells Zlatan, you don't know what you've got, meaning you're much more talented than I am. And you have this unlimited potential, which I don't have. Nedved at this point is, has just been Footballer of the Year, Ballon d'Or. And so Zlatan's career from that point, he has this incredible talent, and he's now married it with the work ethic that he's learned from Mino and from Nedved.
So we can thank Mino Raiola for the incredible longevity of Zlatan Ibrahimovic.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that this guy who was an irresponsible, ineffectual teenage forward had a 20-year career at the top of European football. And also, if you track Zlatan's 20 years and his various moves, you see how at every juncture, Mino anticipates the way the transfer market is moving. So it's not just assessing where the club is now, but where is the club going to be a year from now, 2 years from now, when you're trying to move a player. And Mino can anticipate these changes because he's picking up information all the time. He's traveling around Europe nonstop, 11 months a year, meeting executives from all the top clubs. So he can see exactly where each top club is headed, which players they need, are they running short of money, this kind of thing. So
he's described himself, he's basically the Warren Buffett of football, right? So he describes himself a bit like an investor. He has a series of assets, he has a portfolio, his players, and he needs to judge which way the market's going based on various factors, the trends in football, management changes, who's coming up, who's coming down, who's got the commercial TV rights, who doesn't. It's an incredibly complex...
that's a very good analogy.
Strategy.
Yeah.
Well, he talks about himself in those terms. I guess a bit like, if you told him straight up, he'd be like, yes, of course, that's true. But I think he already sort of subconsciously, that's the way he perceives what he does.
Yeah, where to invest his assets for the long term. Yeah.
To extract maximum value from them.
Yeah. And you're always wondering, has this club peaked? Has this company peaked? He's very wary of a club or a country that is on a downward slide.
Yeah, and he thinks he can see bubbles where things are frothy, get players out of these clubs where something's not sustainable, get them somewhere where they, it's quite remarkable. And I think we're not blowing smoke up his arse by saying that he's an incredibly clever man. I think he was. Sorry, we keep talking about him in the present tense.
Yes. And he told me, it sounds arrogant. I saw every change in the football world coming before it happened.
Right.
So that does sound arrogant, but I think there's some truth in it.
And part of this foresight also extended to many things we've talked about, but also fraud and corruption.
Yeah, so this scandal in Italy has been brewing for a while, Calciopoli. It turns out that a lot of clubs are trying to influence referees. It's not just Juventus, but Moggi is fingered as the chief villain of the story. He's technical director of Juventus, and he is calling referees before matches. There's a big mess because all the clubs are saying, you're worse. But Raiola realizes Juventus are going to get a massive punishment for this approaching referees. And he's right. Eventually, the biggest club in Italian football history, Juve, are relegated legally to Italy's second division for their actions. At this point, Raiola says, we're getting you out of here. And he transfers Zlatan to Inter Milan. But he also sees that Italy is on a slide. In 2009, he moves into Barcelona, at this point, just becoming the best club in the world. This is a transfer that goes wrong because if you listen to our Pep episode, Guardiola has to drop Zlatan. Zlatan has this incredible start at Barcelona. And then Messi indicates wordlessly to Pep that he hates having Zlatan there.
He blinked 3 times on the coach. That was it.
He looked sulky and Pep got it out of him. And Messi kind of says, look, my game is I cut inside from the right and I come into the centre and then there's this big, massive Swede standing in my way telling me to give him the ball. I don't like that. And Pep realises, oh my God, we paid a fortune for Zlatan. He's toast. He has to go. And Zlatan and Mino never forgive this. When I met Mino years later, if you mentioned Guardiola's name, he'd kind of jerk into this Pavlovian response and he'd start shouting, he's a coward, he's got no balls. So he has to move Zlatan back to Italy. He moves him from Barcelona to AC Milan. But Mino can see before the rest of us that Italian football is on the slide. There's no more money. He tells Zlatan, look, in 2012, you have to leave Italy. Zlatan says, this is the best league in the world. Why would I leave? Raiola says, I've been telling Milan for years, you can't afford these salaries anymore. The Italian football economy is on the slide. It's never recovered. Meanwhile, there's these rich Qataris who bought Paris Saint-Germain. To people in Italy, French football doesn't exist. It's like a man bites dog thing, like a great Italian player going to France. What? That's not the way it works. But Mino's the first person to see the money's in Paris now. It's not in Italy. And so he moves Zlatan from Milan to Paris. So he ends up earning 14 million euros a year in a top-class team while Milan sinks. Mino saw it coming. And then, and this is very controversial, I think, for many of our listeners, an unhappy memory, he moves Zlatan and his other top client, Pogba, to Manchester United. You recall the conversation with Ferguson where Mino tells Ferguson, this is a contract my Chihuahua dogs would not sign.
Indeed, the infamous twat conversation.
Yeah, where Mino asked me if I knew what twat means, because he didn't when Ferguson called him that. In a sense, what we see here with the Pogba-Zlatan move to United, this massive move, I think Pogba at that point is the most expensive player in history. And it shows how Mino manipulated clubs that were not as clever as he was. And he spent years planning this move. And the club is like, oh, right, should we sign Pogba? They're just way behind. Even a year before the move, he sees United are going to need a striker. Because what have they done in 2015? They bought these 2 young guys, Memphis Depay and Anthony Martial. Neither of them, as we now know, good enough for the highest level of football, but also just too young.
Yeah.
So United have bet the farm on these guys who don't have it, and Mino sees it. And so he sees a year from now, they're going to want a big, experienced striker. So he's planning for Zlatan to come. And he says United need Pogba too, which I think most people would now say was not correct from United's point of view, but it was correct from Mino's point of view.
It also sounds like he was a little bit motivated by some degree of vengeance. So Fergie's now out and he wants to, by bringing Pogba back to United, he is also getting one over on Fergie. Because that club who he humiliated him is now back and wants his boy.
Using the Warren Buffett analogy, he invests in clubs, but he also takes a stake in the club. So he becomes a decision maker at the club. So when he's talking to United, and this isn't 3 conversations. It's years of conversations. When he's saying to United, compared to Raiola, not very bright people running the club, when he says, look, you need Zlatan, you need Pogba, and I tell you what else you need, and I'm advising you, he's becoming a kind of advisor.
The sage of Haarlem.
The sage of Haarlem. He told me, at clubs that understand me, I have 3 or 4 players, now at Manchester United, and before at Juventus, Milan, Paris Saint-Germain. And he says, I've really become the club's in-house consultant. And I think that's what he wanted at United, and he achieved at United. And it was unthinkable with Ferguson, because Ferguson didn't have in-house consultants.
And even today, most recently, Matthijs de Ligt, Mazraoui, both Pimenta clients, they're at United.
If you are still a club with very weak, under-informed leadership, and if, like Rafaela, you're brighter than the club, that's a lot of power.
I heard something that Jorge Mendes' daughter was interned at United, which was part of the strategy of getting closer to super agents, which also shows you the changing power dynamics between clubs and agents. That clubs need to do things to make sure that they're on the right side of agents too.
Now, United pay Juventus a world record transfer fee for Pogba. I think it's over 90 million quid. Now, this is the biggest deal of Raiola's career. He always claimed that he only took a cut of the player's salary and he didn't take money from clubs. And he said, that's so that I can work exclusively for the player. I don't have to take the club's interest into account. And I said, look, hang on. There's a lot of media reports that you were paid something like 20 million euros by United as a percentage of Pogba's transfer fee. And this has apparently been exposed by football leaks since.
Yeah, so there was this scandal called Football Leaks, which was the publishing of documents by some media organisations about the details of the contract, which seemed to show that Raiola was on the payroll of Juventus and of United, and ultimately came away with that deal with about 40 million euros, just under 20 from United and just over 20 from Juventus. And Juventus were paying him to get the highest fee for Pogba. They said, get the biggest transfer you can and we'll give you a cut. And he was also then got another cut from United. So he was playing, as he denied to you, but he was playing both sides.
Well, he said to me, I mean, this is the biggest moment of his career, what it had been just 2 months before we met. And he says, I can't talk about the contract, but in a deal like Pogba's, it's not just the clubs who earn from it. I said, were you paid a fee by Juve? And he said, no, not in the way that you're saying it. Okay. Meaning, in some way, yes. Yeah. I said, so you did get money from Juve? And he said, I have to see how I can phrase this in a way that Juventus cannot tackle me through the law, let's say. How can I say it? And then he pauses and he thinks for a while. And he says, yes, in this deal, Juventus was not the only owner of the players' rights. Voila. And I said, but third-party ownership of players, i.e. an agent or anyone else owning a bit of a player, that's not allowed anymore.
Interrupting Carlos Tevez arrangement.
He said it was allowed when we did it, because it was only banned in 2015, he said.
I think it was also allowed in Italy, it wasn't allowed in England. Or there was some kind of loophole.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to be a football lawyer like Rafaela to completely understand this. But I said, so until third-party ownership was banned, you often owned stakes in players. And he said, not often, but sometimes. So I think that Raiola's financial relationship with players and clubs was more complex than he was suggesting. Now, he didn't quite con United, but they definitely regretted buying Pogba. They possibly regretted buying Zlatan. I mean, salary would have been very high. Yeah,
but it was a short stint and they didn't learn their lesson, because then they signed Edison Cavani and they just kept repeating their same mistakes. So that one's on United, I think.
Yeah, well, if you have weak directionless leadership, and clever people are going to take advantage of you, and that's Mino. And I'm sure other agents also foisted players on United for huge salaries in exactly that way. Because since 2013, every clever person operating in the football market thinks, now what's a club with loads of money and no sense? I know. Yeah. Let's go straight to Old Trafford. Yeah. Whereas you can't do that to City. Whatever City's financial peculiarities, they don't do stupid stuff.
They do some stupid stuff, but they can afford to do it within reason.
I mean, it's impossible
Calvin
to get...
Phillips, Jack Grealish.
Yeah, I mean, Grealish still plays a fair bit. It's impossible to get 100% of your transfers right. And also, City are buying 22 good players, so, you can have someone like Grealish who you need occasionally.
But Zlatan doesn't suffer any ill effects from being at Manchester United at a terrible time.
No, he moves on. He's very old by this point, but he's still got this kind of Pavel Nedved hunger taught him by Mino. He plays in Serie A into his 40s. And if you take cumulative transfer fees, he was briefly the second most expensive footballer in history after Angel Di Maria. Over 150 million quid in transfer fees paid for Zlatan by 2016. So what a career. And I'm guessing that if he hadn't met Raiola when he was 19, he wouldn't have had that career.
Indeed. But Zlatan is a clear success story, both for him professionally and a lucrative opportunity that Raiola spotted. But he doesn't always get it right. What are some of the ways that he's got it, or he admits himself that he got it really wrong?
I don't want to flatter myself, but although I was completely charmed by him, I think he enjoyed the conversation too, and he was quite frank. I mean, obviously he's cleverer than I am, so he knows when to be frank. But I think he felt fairly open. He wanted to talk. He was usually quite happy with journalists. He like a lot of people in Dutch football, he likes talking. At one point he says, look, sometimes my career plan for a footballer goes horribly wrong. And so obviously we got talking about Mario Balotelli, who as we speak, he's now 34, is trying to give his disappointing career a last act at Genoa, which is, a guy who could have had a career like Ibrahimovic. Mino said the thing about Balotelli is he just didn't care enough about succeeding, and he'd often get distracted by falling in love. And Mino said Balotelli has chosen, unconsciously or consciously, not to put football in the middle of his life. So there were always marginal phenomena that influenced his performances. Zlatan doesn't have that. Pogba doesn't. Nedved doesn't. These are guys who are monomaniacally focused on, I have to be great every match. And he says, but on the other hand, he had this unfulfilled Dutch talent called Wasim Boy, who's now playing in the Gulf. And he says this guy hasn't made it, but he's also totally focused. So you can be totally focused and not make it. But Balotelli was not totally focused. And I said, are you partly to blame for Balotelli's failure? And Mino said, yes, I am. And a big mistake I made in his career was to let him leave Manchester City and go to Milan. And Mino told him to stay at City. But Balotelli said, no, I'm leaving. Mino says, I should have said, you succeed with City, that's it, period. If I'd have done that, he would have. And I said, well, why should Balotelli want to reach the top? It's probably not worth it, because you can earn millions if you're as good as Balotelli, playing at 90% at smaller clubs in nice towns, you have a nice life. I mean, a lot of footballers do that. It's probably nicer having a career now where you're playing for Nice or Fiorentina than if you're at Manchester City, because you don't have to perform 100% every week. You don't have to win all the time. You don't have to live like a monk. You don't have to put huge pressure on yourself, work hours and hours a day and live this kind of unrelenting high-performance life as someone like Zlatan. And so I said, why would Balotelli want to reach the top? And Raiola said, yeah, that's right. He said, that's why in my recent conversations, I have a question for players, which is, why do you play football? What is your drive? And I said, when you ask them that, what do they say? Well, most haven't thought about it yet. So I send them home saying, go think about it.
I think it's really interesting now to discuss what we think Mino's failures could be. And the one that springs to mind most obviously that we don't know about is Pogba. So listen to our Pogba episode. Pogba is exploited by his family members.
Yeah.
Right? He is financially manipulated by his brothers and their friends. And when you hear Mino talk about his players, he's like, my job and my duty is to protect them from all of this. And now I'm looking back and thinking about, one, that silly documentary, but I think Rafaela and at that point Mino probably know something's going on.
I'm sure they know all about it.
Because this is all bubbling in the background. And then you think about, okay, so they're giving him all this personal attention. That's because they know that he's super vulnerable. It would be, obviously this is all posthumous, but you ask the question, would Mino think that he failed Paul because he wasn't able to stop this from happening? Right? This incredible, terrible scandal. Was there something that he missed? Did he not understand the dynamics of Pogba's relationships with people back home and his brothers?
I think actually the threatening by the gang of old friends happens as Mino is dying. It's in spring 2022.
So they see an opportunity.
Yeah,
to
the agent's not there anymore.
Exactly.
Now, one thing about being an agent for that long, for 30 years, is that generations of your clients retire, so you keep losing clients, your players. That means two things. One is you have to make sure they're going to have comfortable retirements, because a lot of footballers burn their money. So they get divorced immediately on retiring, many of them. And then there are all these people coming up to them and saying, I have got a brilliant investment scheme that you should put all your money in. England's Professional Footballers Association, the trade union, has estimated that 10 to 20% of ex-players go bankrupt.
Wow.
And Raiola thought about this a lot. And he said, look, you now have players who can earn 50 to 200 million euros over a career. And then the question is, okay, you have this money, how do you invest it? He said, how do you invest that or not? Because you shouldn't be investing that in anything with risk at all. I mean, you should be putting it in US Treasuries, the lowest risk investment in the world for now. He says that players are always getting offers, investment offers from people. And so his players will call him and say, Mino, a friend of mine has a real estate company and they're going to do this thing and I'm going to get 14% a year guaranteed. And then he thinks, oh my God, where to begin to explain? Because these players have never thought about how to invest. And then suddenly you have 50 million euros and you're a target. Banks are also trying to get them to invest. Banks have these products that they try to sell rich footballers. And he said, what I've done is I've built up an investment portfolio for various players. He had a kind of pension fund for his players. He said, if you add it all up, it's worth about 900 million euros. Yeah. He said, we're more conservative than conservative. He told his players, we do not invest. You're just going to finish your career with the money you earned and maybe a little bit more. But the main thing is not less. Yeah. If you have 50 million euros, you don't have to grow that. You just have to keep it. And so what he told them was buy your own home fast, buy bricks. But otherwise, just keep your money in the bank. Don't care about the interest rate. You don't have to live off the interest. Do not put it into businesses you don't know about.
Or Bitcoin.
I bet a lot of players are now open to Bitcoin scams. Some of them are actually fronting Bitcoin scams.
Yeah, selling shit coins and NFTs.
And he said the best place to buy bricks, it may no longer be true, but he said is Amsterdam, the world's cheapest capital city.
I think that's Berlin. Well, what, Europe's?
Yeah, they all take off, but Amsterdam is much prettier than Berlin. I made the mistake of not buying in Amsterdam in the 90s when it cost nothing, but anyway, that's me.
It's definitely not Europe's cheapest city anymore.
No. Cheapest capital city. Capital. One thing that players want, and you know this from seeing them on Instagram, he said, all my players in the beginning want a restaurant, a hotel, or cafe.
Yeah, they love a restaurant, man.
There's this incredible glamour that they attach to it. Now, Mino grew up in restaurants. His dad was, cleaning the floors at midnight. He said, I tell them, do not come to me with that zero because I know what that is. His dad had worked 18, 20 hours a day. Mino had. You're not going to be a kind of fancy lad with a restaurant that's going to work. Yeah,
they often shutter after a couple of years. The pandemic laid waste to a lot of footballers' restaurants in England.
Who are footballers who had restaurants?
Juan Mata, Xabi Alonso, I think Gary Neville.
These are clever footballers.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is part of their portfolio, but yeah, they loved a restaurant.
So the other thing about players retiring is you always have to look for new players to replace the ones who are leaving. So in 2016, he said, look, I've got loads of players coming up, great players in the Brazilian youth team. And he said, I've got this kid at Roma, this 17-year-old goalkeeper, Donnarumma. I mean, he was already the first team at Roma, so...
And when he was 17, he also looked like he was 35.
And he had Moise Kean at Juventus, 16 years old. And Kean, he's had a reasonable career. He's at Fiorentina and he's an Italian international, although nowadays I think everyone's an Italian international.
It's also rapping.
Oh, well, maybe he can have a second career. But, Mino did have Donnarumma, and sometime after we talked, he signed this Norwegian kid, Erling Haaland. More about whom in a moment. But he was going to be so much more than an agent because Mino had all this energy. He didn't do any parenting, so he had a lot of time. And so he had these very broad ambitions in football. He was always attacking FIFA. FIFA once fined him for calling their president, our friend Sepp Blatter. Thank you, Sepp, for being on our podcast. He called Blatter a senile dictator. And Mino briefly tried to run for president of FIFA. He wanted to reform FIFA.
Or destroy it from within.
Yeah, for him, I think that was the same. He also wanted to become enlightened dictator of Italy, where he would split the country into north and south.
I think Maloney's doing that now, no?
Yeah, I thought it had already happened. And he also wanted to switch career and go into mergers and acquisitions. And the other thing is he wanted to buy a football club. So he tried to buy Roma, and he said he was about to buy Queen's Park Rangers. Oh. It was about to happen, and then this goal went in that won them promotion to the Premier League.
Did it become too expensive?
Yeah, once in the Premier League, it was off, yeah.
So we've mentioned Erling Haaland. Let's talk about this transfer. It's the 2021-2022 season, and every big club in the world wants Erling Haaland, but Mino Raiola gets to decide who gets him.
Yes, so this is going to be the next big transfer of Mino's life, but it's a transfer he will never actually live to see. He's playing the various bidding clubs off against each other. It's much like the Pogba transfer in 2016, but maybe even bigger. It's going to be his ultimate payday. But then suddenly he falls ill. Over Christmas and New Year, his business partner, Rafaela Pimenta, is visiting her family in Brazil, and she gets a phone call saying, you need to come back because Mino is very sick and he had some kind of pulmonary illness. Mino and Rafaela had been business partners for 20 years. Their Monaco agency is called One Sports Business Strategy. It's one of these very generic names that you see on scammers' websites where you have to click the link.
It's not that comforting when the last two letters are BS.
Maybe deliberate. And now the public face of the agency, Mino, is terminally ill at 54. I mean, I said to Rafaela when I interviewed her afterwards, did he know right away that he was going to die? And she said, yes, he knew right away. And so he's on his deathbed in a Milan hospital. Ibrahimovic visits him, I imagine Pogba as well. In his death throes, his death is prematurely announced twice, which means that he gets to read his first obituaries while he's in his hospital bed. And a day or two before he dies, in April 22, there's this tweet from his Twitter account which says, current health status for the ones wondering, pissed off, second time in 4 months, they kill me.
We have to talk about how ridiculous this was, that the world's elite sporting press, L'Equipe, Gazzetta, I think even English newspapers, including my own, were reporting that Mino Raiola was dead when he wasn't. And I just think there's something incredibly darkly befitting about the fact that the man who gave us perhaps the greatest ever transfers in world football, which was subject of incredible social media hype. His own death is the subject of Twitter rumours and wildfires. And also someone, I think he had a complicated relationship with the press, but I think he disparaged the press for sort of creating villains out of agents. He felt that we fell for the FIFA jibes about agents as being villains. And in some ways, his death proves that there is something completely rotten about the media industry who don't check their sources and were constantly reporting he was dead when he wasn't. I mean, it was an incredible time to be alive.
Well, Mino, we are here to redress the reputation of agents. We are very pro-agent on the whole. We
are pretty pro-agent. Yeah. Not to give a spoiler but to the end of the episode, but yeah, I think we are. But in the end, it only takes a couple of days and his death is formally announced.
He leaves a wife, 2 sons, and the unfinished Erling Haaland deal. I said to Rafaela, did you and he discuss the business handover? And she said, no, he was dying. We didn't talk about business. She said there was something bigger in his head, his own life and the review of his own life. How did I live my life? What do I still want to tell my kids? And how can I manage my health so that this day is not worse than yesterday? And she says, I refuse to ask myself, what am I going to do when Mino passes, until he passed. So he dies in spring 2022 and football goes on. And if you're an agent, it's on every day. And Rafaela says it takes your full soul to be an agent. You cannot split it. You can't say, I'm an agent sometimes. So she's on her way to Mino's funeral and she gets a call from West Ham saying we want to renegotiate the contract of the goalkeeper, Alphonse Raiola. And Raiola calls Rafaela and says, we're going to do this together, right? So meaning, I need you, you're my agent. Mm.
But crucially, they don't know it's the day of Mino's funeral. Nobody knows.
No, I don't think they knew.
It's not public information.
No, it's not that West Ham or Raiola were acting in bad taste. They don't realise this. Meanwhile, Rafaela's other problem is that everyone in the football agenting business thinks, a lot of big players are coming free because obviously Mino was the guy who ran the whole show and now he's dead. So
let's pick them off.
Not realising that Mino and Rafaela were equal partners and she is their agent now. And so everyone's trying to poach her players. And some of the people who are trying to poach are people who are collaborators of her own agency. So what Mino and Rafaela had is they'd have these kind of sub-agents in specific cities where they had players, and the sub-agent would manage the everyday handling of players.
Like contractors.
Yeah. So the player would say, my parents are arriving at the airport, can you pick them up? Or my house is on fire, can you sort it out? So they had these sub-agents, and the sub-agents obviously got to know the players well. And these sub-agents, they wanted to become what Rafaela calls the local Mino. Like, I'll take over these 2 players in Manchester, whatever, and I'm going to do that job. But she says that amidst this turmoil, her players stayed loyal to her because she and Mino built these very close personal relationships, and they're very personable people. They're people you like. I mean, I have to say that about both of them.
Yeah.
They're 2 of the most likable people I've met in football. She says she hadn't really thought about whether to continue after Mino, but she says the answer was given by the players who relied on her to go on. And so then she becomes football's first solo female super agent. She's running the shop alone.
Yeah.
Is she the most powerful woman in football?
Well, I mentioned Marina at the top, and she describes that when she was first sort of trying to find her feet, it was people like Marina at Chelsea who would open the door for her. She said, there are a few women, senior women in top levels of football, and the ones who were there, we helped each other out. And now she's Queen Bee, undisputably.
I think so, yeah. Immediately, that summer 2022, she wraps up the biggest transfer in football, which is Erling Haaland's move from Dortmund to Manchester City. He could have gone anywhere. They choose City. She says Mino never knew that he went to City. But like most of their big transfers, it's something they've been plotting for years. They've been planning for years. Where's Haaland going to go? He's going to go to City. Because Rafaela told me you can't expect a club just to wake up and say, what a beautiful day, I'm going to spend 100 million euros. Although it wasn't, I think it was much lower than that for Haaland.
It was his buyout clause, around 60 million.
But still, it's a lot of money. And she says you have to plan this with the club and walk through the process with the club, because the club needs to put this budget together to get that much money together for the salary and the transfer. It might take 2 or 3 seasons. So you can't just say, this summer we're going to buy Haaland. You have to anticipate it 2 years before to put the money aside. Now, I think there's something odd about the Haaland transfer, which is that it was stalemated and there were a lot of clubs bidding, and there was talk that Mino wanted his slice, like with the Pogba transfer. Now, very soon after Mino dies, the move is agreed. There's no more messing. Haaland's going to go to City. And I suspect that Mino's own interest may have been holding up that deal.
Well, Haaland does end up getting, I think, the second most lucrative contract given out in the Premier League. I think Kevin De Bruyne is the only one that's on more than him. So, okay.
For a young Norwegian who's never played in the Premier League, that's a pretty good achievement.
Yeah. And having a low transfer fee, low by its standards, means that you can earn so much more in your contract.
Yeah, but I think clubs were balking at, we have to pay you, and then we have to pay Mino a big slice as well. My interpretation, which I don't think his agency would back up at all, is that his personal demands were holding up the deal.
Yeah, when you meet Alfie next, I'm sure
he'll tell me. Yeah. So now Rafaela's doing the job alone. She has various people working for her, several women too, but she works like Mino did. And I think like she's been working for years. She spends the season touring clubs, planning transfers. She says the questions you ask are, who's going to retire? Who's getting older? Who's injured? Who's doing bad? Maybe this will happen there. It's like a chess game, she says, and you try to anticipate the move. There's 10 or 20 clubs at the top, and you have to know all their intentions and all their problems.
Is she finally getting the respect she deserves in the football industry? What do we think?
I think more and more. I think she's also profiling herself, putting herself forward in a way that she wouldn't want to do, because she needs football to know there is a new agent and you're going to have to deal with her, because there was this assumption when Mino died that there was a vacuum, and she had to say, there is not a vacuum, I'm right here. So she's now recruiting the agency's 6th generation of talents, if you come back 30 years. And she's expanded the back office from 3 employees to 6, because she says footballers' needs have grown too complex for the old style one person, one show agent. Yeah, they're, like we said at the beginning, they're going from mom and pop stores to becoming corporations. Now, you will be astounded to hear that Rafaela Pimenta encounters misogyny in the football industry. This amazes you, right?
Oh, mad.
Yeah.
Crazy story.
Yeah, this is very much about football, because obviously in the industries where you work, this doesn't happen.
Never.
Yeah. She told me if Margaret Thatcher were an agent, they would question her. They'd say she could run a country but not be a football agent, because in football, many men believe they are the only ones who know. This, again, is the stupidity of the industry. She told me she was negotiating with a club executive who was trying to renege on paying agreed bonuses to one of her players. And the executive was saying, we're not going to pay them after all. And so they meet. The executive says, I exchanged a lot with you by email, but now it turns out you really exist. And the executive says, I thought you were just a hooker from Brazil.
Oh, my God.
It's so subtle, isn't it, football? Yeah. She says, I'm not. But even if I was, you'd still have to pay the bonuses. And I said, this is amazing, shocking. How can you deal with someone like that? And she says, I still do business with that guy. She says, that's just the way it is. I deal with it. And she said, I don't think it's humiliating to be a woman, so I don't care. If that's how you try to make me feel bad, it's very stupid. I mean, again, the human subtlety of Mino and Rafaela, if they wanted to make you feel bad, attack you, they'd do a much better job of it than that.
True.
Just some incredibly off-beam insult. I said to her, what about these giant player salaries? And she said, I'm fine with that. You're in an industry where there's lots of money and the player's entitled to that. What upsets me is where there's this disconnection with reality. So the player thinks, I make a lot of money. I can do what I want. I can say what I want. I'll take the Ferrari and go to Monaco. And she says, if you do that, you're an asshole.
She's very much an extension of the Raiola school of keeping grounded and keeping working.
Yeah, and you don't deserve your bling. Yeah. But you do need the money. So what they care about is money as a long-term proposition for the player and the family. Well, that's what they argue anyway.
And the profligacy is offensive to them, right?
Yeah, you should not be throwing this money away because this is what your family will need forever.
And so you actually asked her why she is an agent.
Yeah, because, she came from a different world. She came from academia. And now she's representing people who are signing 10, 20 million euro contracts. So I said, why are you an agent? And she said, I believe in it because you can change the lives of people when you do it right. She said, it's priceless when you meet someone who's sleeping on the floor in favelas in Brazil. And after a few years, he can provide for the next 3 generations of his family.
Simon, do we think then that being a football agent is the most lucrative caregiving job in the world?
Yeah, they should rebrand themselves as carers.
Yeah, and then the UK government would find a way to pay them less money. Or FIFA's already tried very hard. So let's begin to wrap up. Our final section is about legacy. I guess in some ways it's very apt because Mino is no longer with us. We've spoken about him changing the individual careers and lives of professional footballers, but also shaping the nature of the football transfer market, which is a very sensitive subject, right? When people talk about why football's gone mad and football's gone wrong, it's usually because of transfers and it's usually because of money. But the two of us are kind of launching as the Americans say, we're doing a defense operation of agents, right?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of sharking and they do take enormous amounts of money out of the game. And
it's not particularly well regulated.
Barely regulated at all. In essence, it's very hard to stop anyone representing a player. Like if some convicted criminal walks out of jail and comes into your club and said, I'm representing one of the best players in the world, the club will sit down with him. Yeah.
And I guess what we're talking about here is the kind of apex of super agents who do their job so well. I'm reminded of episodes like we did on N'Golo Kante and who may have suffered from bad representation or people claiming to represent him. And the truth is if someone like Mino had him in his stable, N'Golo would be far less exposed.
Yeah, at some point somebody threatens to shoot him in the knee saying, I'm your agent.
Footballers' families get kidnapped, as we saw with Luis Diaz this year. This is commonplace. Their families are security threats. They are ripe for exploitation and extortion.
Yeah.
It happens. It happened to Pogba.
If I were a footballer, I would definitely want people like Mino and Rafaela to represent me. It would still be way over my head, but I'd feel in better hands. I was talking to fans who say, why do they need agents? I don't have an agent. And imagine you're the 16-year-old, Wayne Rooney or someone, and you're told, oh, United want to sign you, and you go in, you don't know anything about money or finance.
Exactly.
And Alex Ferguson says, well done, lad. Here's the contract, just sign it.
Yeah, and that's what Alex Ferguson did to Ryan Giggs and others over and over again. Eventually, yeah, sure. I'm not saying that they weren't well paid, but the asymmetry in that negotiation is insane.
Yeah. The asymmetry of power and information is enormous.
It's incredible. And none of us as 18-year-olds would want to go to a multinational company and be their prized someone that they want and then just sign up to anything that we think is a good deal because we don't know what's a good deal.
Yeah, and even, a very smart footballer like Jurgen Klinsmann who represented himself. One agent said to me, how does he know what other players are earning? How does he know what salaries are being paid at different clubs in the industry? He probably lost a lot of money on the way.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit uncomfortable for football fans, but I think this is part of the maturation of this industry, right? It's part of better governance. It's part of the money that comes with the game that this sort of stuff we need to have it, right? I'm all for workers' rights, right? Players cannot collectivize so much like workers can in other sort of more conventional work environments, but agents is a way for them to protect themselves.
And the counterfactual is if players are paid much less and they don't have good agents, and you have the manager saying, here, kids, sign this, and so you cut the wages by 90% at the top, or you have salary caps, who ends up with that money?
And as a fan?
It's the club owners. The club owners would be so much richer if the players didn't. The players are the only big expense in football.
I'm a match-going fan. Am I more comfortable with Cole Palmer getting a slice of my season ticket than Todd Boehly? Of course I am, and most fans would be. Now, the other one is, what if it's not Cole Palmer, or if it's some useless bench warmer, whatever.
Yeah, but that useless bench warmer is still a million times better than almost anyone who's ever kicked a ball in their lives. And we all played football, and we all wanted to be as good as Cole Palmer, and we know that we can barely sense the immense quality and application required to be that good a footballer.
And Mino's one. So I've heard him speak about the idea that football is a topsy-turvy industry. He says, compare it to theatres and the actor. The football industry thinks that because they've built the stadiums, the theatres, that's why players and actors exist, when actually it's the other way around. The only reason we have football is because we have talented footballers. The fact that we give them a stage, right, is a privilege on our part. It's not the other way around. And he's right, because now modern fan culture is moving away, I think, so much from loyalty to clubs to what is disparagingly called player FC. Right? Fans have become fungible and they're promiscuous. They follow players where they go. They'll buy their shirts. They'll suddenly become Inter Miami fans or start watching Saudi football because they're attached to the players. And Mino was right.
Well, some, but even if you're, say, a traditional club supporter and you're a big Manchester United supporter, you get very, very excited if there is a good player coming to your club and you're willing for your club to pay what it takes to bring him.
Yeah, and I'm out here saying 100 million for Caicedo, just pay it. Pay the bloody... I just want to see him in the shirt, right? And so in that sense, I think the legacy of Mino Raiola was that ultimately he was proved right. And this is a game about players. And if we're giving them better representation and allowing them not to be exploited, I'm fine with that.
Well, it's the ultimate talent industry because there are no fake good players. If you're playing at a top club and you're doing well, the level of quality and application you have is unbelievable. You didn't get there because of who your daddy was. You didn't get there because of where you went to school. You didn't get there because you got lucky. Now, if you compare that to professions that we've looked inside of, like journalism or finance or politics.
AI's coming.
Yeah.
When's AI going to replace footballers? It's not, not for a while.
No.
And we're all far more in the crosshairs of it than...
Yeah. It's a profession where there is no alternative to excellence at the top level. And as I see, there's so many professions where you see people at the top level who are not excellent.
I think the one area where Mino is becoming, or the super agent is becoming a bit of a throwback, is their ability to provide this incredibly bespoke, individualized service. So I mentioned at the top that super agents have given way to super agencies. So now footballers are not just athletes, they're truly celebrities. You have companies whose job it is to represent them in every area of their commercial life. This is all of their brand deals. This is their sponsorships outside of football. This is their television, image rights, all the rest of it. And Rafaela also speaks about the fact that this industry is changing really fast. And she, who was once a pioneer, is now having to try and keep hold of these players. So I think I mentioned Rock Nation before, which is Jay-Z's agency where musicians and NBA stars are represented. And now footballers like Vinicius and Lukaku and Rashford are part of these global branding organizations. And this is just maybe just the natural step. So we might look back on the super agent era with some degree of nostalgia because it's actually changing really, really fast. She
said to me a lot of players now want to do their branding themselves. They're building up an Instagram following, this kind of thing.
Yeah, they're making music. Yeah, they're publishing on labels.
Yeah, she says to them, you only have one job. Yeah. Your only job is to be a footballer.
And that's actually becoming less fashionable now. So I think, bizarrely, we might look back on the Pimenta, Raiola focus on just play the game and everything else will come. They're much more exposed to other types of distractions now.
Yeah, well, then you become like Anna Kournikova, that you play a little bit of sports and then you become an influencer.
Voila. Yeah. So let's end with our traditional couple of questions. So what would Mino and Rafaela be doing if they weren't involved in football? What do you think?
I think with Mino, it's very clear. He would have been owner of a chain of about 500 pizza restaurants, and he would have been in every one every day at lunchtime.
500 lunch, Mino. And Rafaela?
She would be an underpaid law professor in Brazil, but really, really good, like the best professor on your course. I don't know whether she would have stuck it.
I don't know about politics. Maybe she could have ended up working in Lula's government or the central bank.
Not so much in a public-facing role. I think she's quite happy with not having the limelight.
Official them. Okay, and very finally, I think this one's a bit obvious, but would we like to hang out with them? Well, you already have.
I'm so sorry I only had the one afternoon with Mino. I mean, no, we we said at the end, let's meet. And he said, come to Monaco as my guest. And I said, look, I'm a journalist. You can't pay me to come and see you. I said, well, we'll meet, but you're not going to pay for me to come. So it was like we were friends already.
Was there ever a chance to have the second or never?
I never really pursued because I dip in and out of football. So much later I met Rafaela again. She was at the Financial Times Football Business Conference last year or the year before. And so I feel I still have some kind of connection. Yeah. Would you like to hang out with them based on what we've said?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, one factor we should mention is that I massively appreciate Mino's attempt to bring decent food to the culinary wasteland that is the Netherlands. And for that, he will always have a very special place in my heart.
The one thing I wouldn't want to do is negotiate against them because they would totally destroy me if they were on the other side of the table.
It's a bit like this podcast.
Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms. Next week's episode is on Geoff Hurst and England's 1966 World Cup winning team. This is a story of heroes who were treated very much like ordinary humans after the greatest triumph in English sporting history. Be sure to check it out. This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
and Simon Cooper.
And this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.